Today we're reviewing the NVIDIA RTX 3060 Ti because NVIDIA has decided that there need to be more products on the market with GPUs in them. So we're reviewing the 3060 Ti. It's been a lot of GPU reviews lately. We're still, however, going to look at a pretty full suite of tests: frequency, thermals, noise, and RPM, and then of course games and RTX games. We have cut a couple of tests from this because it's been non-stop GPUs for several months now. But this is still a pretty full-featured review of the 3060 Ti, which is supposed to be a $400 video card for the floor MSRP pricing. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's Conductonaut Liquid Metal. Conductonaut is what we've used in all of our liquid metal and delid thermal tests, capable of dropping CPU thermals significantly when replacing the stock thermal interface. Lower CPU thermals don't just allow better overclocks, but also lower noise levels because the transfer efficiency is increased. The mix of gallium and indium makes for a thermal conductivity of 73 watts per meter Kelvin, outclassing traditional pastes significantly. Learn more at the link in the description below. So the 3060 Ti, we're again starting with the Founders Edition model. It's the NVIDIA card, which is supposed to be $400. The partner models, we're not so sure what the pricing is going to look like for those, assuming you can get them. We're at the point you can get them anyway, because it sounds like the pricing is somewhat unachievable for a good cooler and maintaining that pricing in the long term, past the expiry of, say, MDF, for example, or rebates, or other modes of getting discounts on the supply from NVIDIA. Anyway, whatever the pricing ends up being for the partner models, the FE card we're reviewing is a $400 model. The FE 3070 is $500. The RX 6800 reference is supposed to be $580. And then you've got the 6800 XT and the 3080s in a different price class altogether. The weird thing, though, about the 3060 Ti, reviewing it that is that it doesn't have a direct competitor from this generation. So we don't have an AMD card in the $400 price class yet, which makes it a bit of an awkward comparison because the closest AMD card that makes sense would be the 6800, and that's a lot more money. The NVIDIA cards, there aren't any other lower-end ones. There's no 3060 non-Ti, there's no 3050 yet, and those will be coming out at some point, but probably not until next year since we're so close to the end of this one. So that makes the 3060 Ti review a little awkward because it's sort of like a, well, if you're trying to spend $400, then I guess this is it. This is the one. You can buy it, or you can spend $100+ more, which is probably not feasible for most people planning to spend $400 on a card. Nonetheless, though, in the very least, we'll be able to help you decide if spending an extra $100 would even be worth it for you if you were considering, say, a price floor 3070. So we're going to keep this one fairly simple in terms of reviews, just because we've done a lot of GPU reviews now, where we need to sort of do some other reviews at this point. And so we've trimmed a couple of the charts, but all the stuff you need still in there, especially the gaming stuff, some overclocking as well. Overclocking, as a quick forenote here, was fairly successful on the card, but the actual gains from it were highly variable. Sometimes it was unstable, the clocks that we chose in some of the games, and other times you got a 10% uplift, 12% in the highest case, which is absolutely huge for an OC uplift. But with a little bit more time, we could tune it some more. We'd probably have to walk it back. You'll see that in the OC stepping charts, though. Now, before getting into the review charts, a reminder on smart access memory and SAM testing. We ran, as part of the 6800 XT review, we ran a series of smart access memory tests with the AMD card. NVIDIA does not yet have the PCIe resizable BAR feature for its 30 series. It's planning to roll that out, and it's planning to have it be platform neutral, but it hasn't done it yet. So AMD is still the only company that has the PCIe resizable base address register via SAM. That we already tested. We have not rerun all of the tests on an AMD platform at this time, but we will once we do our next refactoring of GPU benchmarks. But for now, if you want the full SAM impact, you can check our 6800 XT review. It is anywhere from 0% to a couple percent on average, with the outlier being about a 10% uplift in Hitman 2. But that won't be in here, and since the 6800 is so distant in price anyway, it doesn't really matter. So we're going to walk through it with what we have. You can check SAM benchmarks in the previous content. We've removed the 3090 from a lot of the game charts because it's $1,500, so it's not particularly relevant. Let's get into it. We've got a lot of numbers to go through, so we'll get started. We always start with a frequency plot to validate that the devices we're testing are working properly. We're looping a 3D Mark frame on repeat to test the frequency response for this one. Ideally, you'd see a flat line, but that's not really what we encounter in the real world. Typically, you get a flat line when you've got a high-end air cooler, or more likely a liquid cooler, and boosted power targets with that. In this chart for the Founders Edition 3060 Ti, we see what we expect, which is a brief peak at the very beginning, and then an immediate frequency decay and fall off to a steady state frequency of about 1950 megahertz. This next chart is zoomed in to help aid with the comparison between other 30 series GPUs. The 3060 Ti plots first, and also highest, for its average sustained frequency. Next, the RTX 3070 FE plots at what will become the bottom of this chart, at about 1914 megahertz average. The 3080 FE fills in the middle. This is somewhat expected behavior at this point, where lower-end NVIDIA GPUs often have very minor clock advantages over their immediate next larger-sized die counterpart. But they drop hardware-level improvements in exchange for that by nature of going to a smaller die size. The net result is that clearly a 3060 Ti will still be worse than the other two in terms of raw performance, but it's able to take advantage of improved stability at higher clocks due to reduced hardware complexity and close a bit of the gap, as far as it can anyway, without increasing the GPU complexity or skew. We often do noise normalized testing to determine the efficiency and advantages of various models of the same GPU, like partner cards, so the best could then be chosen among them. When it comes to a new FE card though, since it's basically launching in a vacuum until we get the partner models to test against, we don't have anything to compare to yet. So we run under auto conditions to learn about the VBIOS GPU temperature targets and the fan ramp behavior. This can also help with studying fan hysteresis in some cards as well, where sometimes it's a little bit too latent and you get an acoustic response that is overbearing in some of the cards we have looked at. Running the same frozen frame repeat render from the previous chart, the RTX 3060 Ti holds about 70 degrees Celsius here, which is a mix of ambient conditions of 21°C and of VBIOS temperature targets and of course the fan curve. Thermally, that's fine. We'll need to look at GDDR and VRM component temperatures to see how the less frequently monitored aspects of the GPU do, but we'll probably save that for the partner comparisons. As for the fan behavior, that ramps at a similar pace to the GPU temperature ramp. There isn't much of an initial delay or lag for the fan to start spinning, which is typically a good thing, and it spins up to about 1600 RPM to sustain the 70-degree temperature. Before getting into the games and overclocking, here's a quick noise chart. The fans are the same as the 3070 FE, and the noise levels are therefore the same. So this chart applies to both the 3070 FE and 3060 Ti FE. The noise level in our auto VBIOS conditions previously shown would put us at about 34 dBA at 20-inch distance, so NVIDIA has room for more aggression on the fan if it wants, but it's a well-balanced thermal and noise configuration for this specific model. Partner cards, of course, will likely outdo this in many instances, but overall, this seems fine. Our overclock stepping table shows the raw notes for the process of overclocking the 3060 Ti. This is how we take notes while walking through the OC process, and it just helps us keep track of things. It includes port royal scores on the far right as a means of validating whether the performance improved or decayed, the latter of which can happen if you have error correction on the memory from running an unstable memory clock, or just unstable core clocks that appear stable because it's completing the test, but might actually be nuking the performance. The temperature column isn't that useful here, and you shouldn't be taking it as a measure of thermal performance. The previous charts did that. It's only there to correlate against the frequency, which change based on thermals, but because these tests are constantly crashing or restarting, there's no constant load, and so the temperature chart isn't meant to be used that way. The stock test had the frequency at 1875 to 1920 megahertz at initial run, and we typically do a TimeSpy extreme looping test for stress test for initial validation, then run port royal. It fell to 1860 to 1890 megahertz after a few minutes, and we found that a range of 2040 to 2085 megahertz was possible to run and appeared stable, including a 1200 megahertz memory offset. But technically, it offered no improvement over the 1000 megahertz memory offset of the previous run. 7314 points over 6709 means a 9% performance uplift in this RT-heavy benchmark. Power was still the primary limiter, as expected, and this is where partner cards could potentially offer an advantage. The memory on the 3060 Ti for our overclocking, though, was ridiculous. We suspect we got lucky on the draw with this one, because this kind of offset and OC performance on just a reference, well, an FE board is not common, and ours happened to scale very well. We did have to drop it a little bit for Horizon Zero Dawn because it wasn't as stable in that game as it was in the others, but you'll see that in the game benchmarks. This next chart is for Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K. We'll bring down the resolution as we go for each game. The RTX 3060 Ti held 59 FPS average with these settings, RTX off here, with lows paced well behind at 54 and 53 FPS. We have no frame pacing issues on the 3060 Ti for this 4K benchmark, so things are looking good. The 2080 Super is just above the 3060 Ti and within run-to-run variants. The overclock didn't do much for us, giving us a 3.7% uplift from the OC 3060 Ti to the stock one. The stock 3060 Ti is about 14.8% better than the 5700 XT Taichi X from the previous AMD generation. It's 16.6% ahead of the 1080 Ti stock for the FTW3 model, and it's 55% ahead of the RTX 2060 KO. As for the 3070, the 66 FPS average isn't really game-changing here, but is a substantial improvement in pure percentage of 11%. The RX 6800 stock card ran 81 FPS average for this one, and that's a 37% uplift over the 3060 Ti in exchange for $180 more against MSRP, but partner models for NVIDIA and AMD obfuscate what the actual price is for these. Either way, though, it's, at least for now, a meaningful uplift in this game in exchange for a lot more money. At 1440p, Tomb Raider has the 3060 Ti at 105 FPS average, which ranks it hierarchically the same as compared to the 2080 Super and the 5700 XT. The 3070 maintains an 11% lead as before, and the RX 6800 maintains a lead of 34%. There's a slight reduction in the 6800 leadership over the 3060 Ti, but most of the rest of the numbers remain comparable. At 1080p, the 3060 Ti maintains a 150 FPS average, with lows again reasonably spaced. The 3060 Ti OC gains 2.6% over stock, proving unworthy of the time. The 3070 FE keeps exactly an 11% lead over the 3060 Ti stock once again, and the RX 6800 positions itself 16% ahead. It's weird reviewing a GPU that, once again, does not have a direct modern competitor. It's an upgrade from the 20 series, yes, but not in a way that demands a new purchase. Moving from the 900 series might make more sense, but moving from the 20 series, probably just keep using it for a little while longer. Next up is Red Dead Redemption 2 with DX12 and at 4K. We'll look at DX12 versus Vulkan scaling momentarily as we test both APIs right now. The RTX 3060 Ti FE stock card held 57 FPS average here, climbing 3% to 59 FPS average with an overclock. The 3070 FE stock card holds a 10.5% lead, consistent now with Tomb Raider and the regular 11% uplift over the 3060 Ti. The RX 6800 maintains a 15% lead. Compared to the 20 series, the 3060 Ti outdoes the 2080 Super stock and everything below it, including the RTX 2060 KO, which is outdone by 60% with the 3060 Ti. Moving to 1440p, the RTX 3060 Ti FE stock card ran 93 FPS average. Our OC didn't move the bar here because it wasn't stable enough, which is a casualty of being overrun with too many reviews, so we've removed it from the results to reduce confusion. The 3070 FE leads the 3060 Ti FE by 10 FPS, or about 10.4%. The 3060 Ti leads the 2060 KO by 54%. 1080 Ti FTW3 stock is led by 31% with the new 3060 Ti in the lead of that, and the 2080 Super is led by the 3060 Ti by 8%. The RX 6800, meanwhile, leads the 3060 Ti by 20%. At 1080p, the 3060 Ti stock card held 113 FPS average with nothing to show from our overclock. We likely need to walk it back a little bit. It's at 116 FPS average here. The 113 FPS average for stock allows the 3070 FE a lead of 8.5%, reduced from some of the previous and higher resolution benchmarks. The 3070 and 3080, as we've seen in the past, tend to expand their lead as the resolution increases, especially as it approaches or reaches 4K. The RX 6800 holds a 20.4% lead here over the 3060 Ti, which is almost identical to its 20% lead and the hierarchical positioning in the 1440p tests. In terms of the Vulkan versus DX12 scaling numbers, here it is. The RX 6800 and 6800 XT lost performance in Vulkan at a 1.2% or 2.5% reduction, while the 3060 Ti and modern NVIDIA cards improve in Vulkan. The Vulkan improvements move the 3060 Ti 6.5% ahead of its DX12 positioning, keeping in mind that the two APIs don't necessarily draw the same thing, so it might not be a pure like for like, and probably isn't. We don't have the development tools to really determine that. Total War Three Kingdoms is next, starting at 4K. The RTX 3060 Ti plotted 29 FPS average here, but we run unreasonably high settings at Ultra, which allows us to get some long-term scaling comparisons for the future as cards advance. It's still interesting because the memory utilization with this configuration is exceptionally high. The RTX 3070's 33 FPS average led the 3060 Ti by 15.4%. The RX 6800 led it by 30%, so we've gained a little bit versus the 1440 and 1080 numbers in Red Dead, and the 3080 led the 3060 Ti by 64% here. At 1440p, we reach a more playable 58 FPS average in the battle benchmark, with the lows paced proportionally behind relative to NVIDIA cards, but they're worse in pacing relative to the 5700 XT or the RX 68 and 68 XT cards. The RTX 3060 Ti stock card held a 13% lead over the 1080 Ti FTW3 stock card, 47% lead over the 2060 KO, and it was led by the RTX 3070 FE by 15.2%. The RX 6800 is further ahead still, keeping pace with the 4K comparisons. So far, it looks like the 3070's lead expanded a little bit, up to 15% from an average of 11 in Shadow of the Tomb Raider for this game. And if you're looking at these numbers worried that you won't be able to get the FPS you want in this game, keep in mind that we're testing with ultra settings. The hierarchy will remain about the same, but the FPS will increase if you're willing to drop your settings down to something more reasonable like high. At 1080p, the RTX 3060 Ti pushes to 92 FPS average with a real gain, finally, to be had from our 3060 Ti FEOC. The overclock allowed us an uplift of 12%, which is huge when compared to the average OC uplift for the rest of this series. It seemed to help us more at 1080p than elsewhere for this game as well. This also allows the 3060 Ti to reach 3070 FE stock levels, which was around 105 FPS average. Stock to stock though, the 3070 FE still leads the 3060 Ti by about 14%, but again, that gap closes with the OC. The RX 6800's 122 FPS average holds a 32% advantage over the 3060 Ti stock card in this one, lifted up over some of the other games. We're going to start going through these charts faster now that a clear trend has been established. You can pause if you need to look at the older cards more closely. Horizon Zero Dawn is next at 4K. The OC does nothing for us and plots within run-to-run variance. We'd need to back this off to try and get a little more performance out of it to see an actual uplift consistently. The 3060 Ti operates 10 FPS below the 3070, so the 3070 keeps its 14% lead from elsewhere. The RX 6800 jumps to a 25% lead here. Previously, it was closer to 20%. Skipping a resolution to 1080p, the 3060 Ti ran 136 FPS average with an OC bumping to 140, and the gap between the 3070 and the 3060 Ti has shrunken here, with only a 5% advantage. The OC pushes them to rough equivalence once again. The RX 6800 falls to a 16% lead from 25% previously. GTA 5 at 4K and with our custom bench settings had the 3060 Ti at 65 FPS average, improving to 67 with the OC. The card is within range of the 2080 Super in both instances, stock and overclocked, and it's about the same. The 1080 Ti FTW3 manages to actually outperform the stock 3060 Ti FE here, so it's not dead yet, but it required a game from 2015, from 2013 to actually beat it. The 3070 maintains its advantage, albeit reduced to 10%. The RX 6800 keeps its 20% lead over the 3060 Ti, as shown in several other titles now. That's enough of these. We'll flash through a couple more charts here, like Rainbow Six Siege, but at this point, we've established what the differences are, and they're not really going to change that much from the average of the averages. But feel free to pause if you want to look at one of these in more detail. We're getting to RTX games now. This testing has 4 games total that we benchmark, with variations on DLSS on or off, in order to provide A/B comparisons with the AMD RX SKUs. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is first, and it has a more subtle use of ray tracing for shadows in that it's the least demanding of our RT benchmarks. At 1080p, the 3060 Ti's 97 FPS average beat all of the 20 series cards except the 2080 Ti. The 3070 FE is 8% ahead in performance, while AMD's RX 6800 is just 4% ahead. $180 for a 4% uplift is not a great start for AMD and the ray tracing benchmarks, but we've already established previously that AMD is on the more anemic side for RT performance right now. Here's the 1440p chart. Higher resolutions widen the gap, but not by much. At 1440p, the 3060 Ti still averaged higher than 60 FPS, but the 3070 Fe is 10% ahead. That's similar to the Tomb Raider benchmarks without RTX enabled, purely in terms of percentage scaling, and is partly thanks to the relatively lightweight RT demands of Tomb Raider. The 6800 did better relative to NVIDIA's cards here, nearly tied with the 3070 and within run-to-run variants. It's 11% beyond the 3060 Ti's result as well. Moving to 4K confirms that higher resolutions favor AMD here. The 6800 is 14% ahead of the 3060 Ti, a more appropriate difference given the prices of the two cards, but that's at just 42 FPS average for the 6800 and 36 for the Ti. This isn't an ideal level of performance for actually playing the game, obviously. Control is the first of two games we test using DLSS, which is a feature that remains exclusive to NVIDIA. That doesn't strongly affect comparisons with NVIDIA's own cards, with the 3070 Fe, for example, being 8% ahead of the 3060 Ti at 1080p. And in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we saw a similar lead. So this scaling thus far has been mostly the same between the games. Since AMD's cards must run without the benefit of DLSS, the 6800 is relatively easily outstripped by everything, down to the 2060 KO, that is. There's no contest when the cards are compared this way. Even disabling DLSS, which apparently according to our viewer base isn't the preferred way to play this game, it does use DLSS 2.0, so that's fair. Even without DLSS though, there's still an advantage of the 3060 Ti over the 6800 by a relatively wide 12% margin. The 3070 Fe's advantage increases slightly with resolution, so let's move to 4K for the full effect. Here, the 3070 Fe is 13% ahead of the 3060 Ti at 47 FPS versus 42 FPS, while the 6800 has dropped down to an unplayable 20.3 FPS average. Without the benefit of DLSS, the 3070 and 3060 Ti have similar difficulties, but even here, the Ti is 11% ahead of the 6800, the same kind of scaling seen at 1080p. Control showed predictable stock versus stock differences for NVIDIA's cards, but the 6800 could not outperform the Ti in a single instance. Minecraft is our second DLSS-enabled game, and the more punishing of the two, despite its intentionally simple art style. DLSS works well as a result of that art style. It's pretty predictable, but the fully path-traced approach and the beta status of the game make it more abusive on the hardware. At 1080p, the 3070 Fe demonstrated its value more than any of the other RTX tests so far, exceeding the 3060 Ti by a much wider 31% lead at 125 FPS average versus 75. Without DLSS, the 6800 is already below 60 FPS at this resolution, averaging just 41 FPS, but it's not an officially supported card with Minecraft in its current beta status, so we're more interested in the NVIDIA comparisons here. Disabling DLSS on the 3060 Ti, though, still allowed it to average 67.1 FPS, which is about 67% ahead of the AMD card. The 3070's advantage over the 3060 Ti is slightly less at 1440p, but it's still 22%. The 6800 struggled along with a 25 FPS average, while the 3060 Ti without DLSS averaged 41 FPS. This is almost the exact same performance advantage as at 1080p, so it's about 66% ahead. Without DLSS, the 3070 Fe's lead was reduced, now 16% ahead of the 3060 Ti. Finally, at 4K, the 3060 Ti still managed 57 FPS average with DLSS, while the 6800 chopped along at 12 FPS average, a 385% advantage for the less expensive card. Evening things out by disabling DLSS still left the 3060 Ti 61% ahead, but with an unacceptable average of 19 FPS. The 3070 Fe couldn't reach a playable frame rate at these settings either, but it did score 17% higher than the 3060 Ti, again demonstrating an area where the more expensive card has some tangible benefit. Quake II is up next. Quake II RTX does not run on the AMD 6000 series cards at all right now, which makes comparisons here a little simpler. We'll run through this one quickly. The 3070 Fe is back to a more reasonable 14% over the 3060 Ti at 1080p, and it maintains approximately the same performance advantage at 1440p. The 3060 Ti is borderline at higher resolutions and not easily playable at 4K with a 21 FPS average. There aren't thousands of people lining up to play Quake II RTX, but these results and the others we've discussed allow us to extrapolate and say that the 3060 Ti isn't a card for 4K gaming with RTX enabled. So not much of a surprise there. But relative to the 3070, we've given you some numbers to help determine whether or not the differences really matter. They start to emerge more here than they did in the pure rasterization-based games. Power benchmarks are up next. We use a physical hardware interposer for this testing that measures power into the PCIe slot and PCIe cables. Combined, this gives us a total card power consumption, and so it's isolated from the system power consumption. If you add our GPU numbers for power to our CPU power numbers, you have a pretty good guideline for the maximum power consumption of the two most demanding components in the system. There's more to it than that, obviously, but that at least gives you a starting point for the type of power supply you should be in the range of, and then have some buffer for fans and everything else. We'll start with the power virus workload for power draw. In Furmark, the RTX 3060 Ti FE stock card pulled about 202 watts during this test, which has it about equal to the EVGA RTX 2070 XC when it was overclocked, also at 200 watts, or about 16% more power than the RTX 2070 XC when it was stock. Compared to the 3060 Ti FE stock card, the 3070 FE stock card pulled about 11% more power, with the RX 6800 at about 18% more power consumption. In our gaming workload, things didn't change very much. The 3060 Ti FE pulled about 200 watts stock and about 10% more with the OC, roughly congruent with the power budget increase permitted on the FE card. We haven't highlighted the 3080 FE on these charts yet, so let's go ahead and do that. The 3080 FE pulled about 321 watts in this workload, boosted over the 3060 Ti by about 120 watts. That's enough for a potential power supply change, but the 3060 Ti and 3070 are close enough that you'll be in a similar class of power supply. Closing it out then, opinions are, once again, there's nothing to compare it to, so we don't really have a strong opinion either way. It's not like if we had another $400 card from NVIDIA or AMD to compare it to, other than the 20 series, which was kind of boring in a lot of ways, especially this price class. The 2060 KO was actually really cool, but not for the reasons that cards are supposed to be. It was cool because NVIDIA had a second SKU of the 2060 that was a 2080 with things turned off, except they forgot to turn off some of the features that made it really good and things like production workloads. So that's why that one was interesting. But compared to the 20 series, for the most part, if you're on 20 series, yeah, it's a big jump, but unless you really feel like your experience is terrible with the card that you have and you hate it, it'd probably skip a generation. It's just wasteful to upgrade from 20 to 30 series. So it's a big jump, yes, but unless you really specifically want something, like maybe specifically higher ray tracing performance, that's like the one thing you really care about. Maybe you do optics or something like that, where you plan to do a lot of ray trace gaming. Then it makes sense, but if you're just looking at it going, it's new, that's not really a good enough reason here, we think. It doesn't stand strong enough on its own, the 3060 Ti especially, to justify a jump from most of the 20 series. A jump from the 2060 KO, yes, is huge in some of these benchmarks where it's up to 50% of an improvement. But short of that, if you're on 2070, 2080 Super, it might feel a little bad to get outclassed so fast, but it's also, it'd be a side grade, it'd be a lateral move, not worth changing the device you're on. And even the 2060 KO, if you're not increasing your resolution past 1080 especially, or 1440 in some cases, then probably stick with it. If you're on an older card, 10 series, 900 series, and it's starting to show its age in gaming performance or whatever it is you use it for, CUDA, otherwise not optics at that point, then the 30 series makes sense, but it's kind of, again, it's hard to draw a conclusion with the 3060 Ti because there's not an immediate adjacent competitor from AMD, and from NVIDIA, the closest thing is the 3070, and the reason it's hard to draw a conclusion for any of this is because the prices are all made up and don't matter. So that's not because they're in any way like fake prices, it's because you can't really get the things. The chances of getting them is very low. So demand is stupid high right now. The chance of rolling the dice and getting a card, not great. And so doing comparisons, it sort of feels like, well, what's the point? But if we're going to try and force a comparison, the 3070 is on average about 11 to 15% better than the 3060 Ti in pure rasterization performance. It sometimes falls to about 8.5%, 8% in 1080p. At 1440 4K, you're looking at 11 to 15% on average. for the 3070 versus the 3060 Ti. Is that worth $100? It's up to you. Probably not, but especially because you can overclock it in cases where ROC was stable, because we saw uplift of 8-10% in some of the higher end scenarios. You're encroaching on 3070 territory anyway, and yes, you can overclock the 3072 in response to that and maintain the distance. But if you're going for 3070 baseline stock performance, you can get that pretty close to it anyway with the 3060 Ti. Not quite, but it's close enough. Now, for ray tracing, the differences are about the same. For the most part, the scaling hierarchically, you're seeing 11% in some of these games, 8% some resolution in some games, but that's about the gap versus the 3070. Versus the 6800, the 3060 Ti is superior where specifically it has DLSS access in RTX games, but the 3060 Ti gets destroyed in rasterization performance, where it's 20 to 25% lead for the RX 6800, non-XT. That, however, does kind of make sense because the pricing is much higher on the 6800. So is there even a point to making that comparison? Well, perhaps not beyond helping someone who's unsure how much to spend and knows more just what kind of performance they want. Then it might help. But if you know what you're going to spend, you're probably on average not stretching that budget another $200 for the card or whatever the price may be for the 6800s right now. So yeah, that's it for this one. We're going to leave you the numbers and let you figure it out, because at this point, it's the market is very strange and difficult to compare and contrast with, because it's not normal for there to be so much demand and low chance of getting a device at this stage in the launch cycle. This is an exceptional year for that. So makes it tough, but you've got the numbers, figure it out. We'd say overall, meh. It's compared to the 2080 Super, yeah, good performance. A lot cheaper for the 2080 Super or 1080 Ti in modern day via the 3060 Ti. You've got a memory reduction, but performance is similar in gaming, so that's cool. But the rest of it's just kind of meh. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus, and we'll see you all next time.